At our 40th anniversary gala in front of 400 guests and 3 live cameras, my son coldly declared, "You're finished. This company is mine now." Then he struck me across the face. The room went dead silent as I hit the floor, blood trickling from my lip. But no one knew that for 10 years I had been quietly setting a trap just for him. And before the sun rose the next morning, everything he thought was his had completely vanished. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, your country, your city. I love knowing who is on the other side of the screen. Note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the message inside is worth keeping. My son slapped me across the face in front of 400 people at my own company's anniversary gala. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I did not fall apart. I did not beg. I did not cry out for anyone to help me. But lying there on the floor of the Harborview Ballroom with the taste of blood spreading across my lip and the sound of 400 people holding their breath all at once, I felt something crack open inside my chest that had nothing to do with the physical pain. It was the sound of 30 years breaking. I had built Sterling Global from a single welding torch and a borrowed dock in Baltimore Harbor. I had buried my wife when Caleb was 2 years old, pressed my face into her hospital pillow, and wept until I had nothing left, and then driven home and made my son scrambled eggs for breakfast because he was hungry, and I was his father, and that was what fathers did. I had worked 20-hour days, missed holidays, eaten cold sandwiches at my desk, and poured every dollar I had back into that company, so that one day my son would have something worth inheriting. And on the night of our 40th anniversary gala, my son used the back of his hand to tell me exactly what he thought all of that was worth. Harrison Pike reached me first. He pushed through the frozen crowd with his briefcase still in his hand, his face the color of ash. And when he knelt down beside me, I could see his jaw working like he was trying to find words and could not locate a single one. "Arthur," he said, and his voice cracked straight down the middle. "Arthur, can you hear me? Can you move?" "I can hear you perfectly well," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Stop looking at me like I'm already dead, Harrison. Help me up." His hands shook as he took my arm. I felt the sharp pull in my ribs where I had hit the edge of the speaker platform on the way down, and for a moment the pain was bright enough to make my vision swim. But I pressed my teeth together and breathed through it and got my feet under me because I had not survived 30 years of building an empire from nothing to be carried out of my own ballroom on a stretcher. When I was upright, Harrison's steadying hands kept me from swaying. I could feel the warm trickle at the corner of my mouth, the stark copper taste of reality settling heavily on my tongue. Around me, 400 people stood exactly where they had been standing when Caleb's hand connected with my face. Not one of them had moved. The room felt like a photograph of itself. I looked at my son. Caleb was standing 6 feet away from me, breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath his dinner jacket. His hand was still slightly raised, as though some part of him had not yet registered what it had just done. His eyes were wild and wet, and his face had gone the color of old wax. "Dad!" he said, and the word came out thin and broken like a man who has just watched himself drive off a cliff and cannot quite believe the ground is that far down. "Dad, I didn't—" "You did," I said. I did not shout. I did not need to. The microphone on the podium was still live, and every syllable I spoke went out across that room like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb's throat moved. His eyes filled, and for one terrible moment I saw the 7-year-old boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during long drives, the boy who had pressed a small wooden boat into my hands and told me he would build big ships so I would never have to work hard again. My heart seized so violently that I had to breathe through my nose to keep my expression from breaking. Then Isabella stepped forward from behind the head table, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes not on me but on Caleb, calculating, already measuring the distance between herself and the disaster her husband had just become. "Harrison," I said, turning away from my son, "we have work to do." "Yes, sir," Harrison said. His voice was rough, but his hand on my elbow was steady. I walked to the main doors of the ballroom. I did not hurry. I did not look back. With every step I took across that floor, I could hear the murmur rising behind me, the low, shocked sound of 400 people beginning to breathe again, beginning to whisper, beginning to reach for their phones. Good, I thought. Record everything. I want them to see all of it. The doors swung shut behind me, and I stepped into the corridor, and the noise fell away, and Harrison walked beside me toward the elevator, with his briefcase gripped in both hands and his mouth pressed into a thin, determined line. "The car's in the lower garage," he said quietly. "I know where the car is," I said. "And Harrison, call the team. Tell them it begins tonight." The limousine pulled out of the Harborview's lower garage and turned south toward the harbor, and I pressed 2 fingers against the cut on my lip and stared out at the water. Baltimore Harbor at night looks the same as it did 40 years ago if you know where not to look. The cranes are taller now, the container ships are wider. The lights along the waterfront have multiplied into something almost beautiful. But the water itself is the same dark water, moving the same way it has always moved, indifferent to everything built along its edges. I have always found that comforting. Empires rise and fall on these docks. The harbor keeps moving regardless. Harrison sat across from me with his briefcase on his lap and his phone already in his hand. His fingers were moving across the screen with the focused precision of a man who had been waiting a very long time to make exactly these calls. "The process servers are standing by," he said without looking up. "I can have the first documents delivered before midnight." "Not yet," I said. "Give me 20 minutes. He looked up then, and I could see the question forming behind his eyes, the same question he had been too professional to ask for 10 years. He wanted to know if I was all right. I answered it before he could speak it out loud. "I am not falling apart, Harrison," I said. "I need 20 minutes to think. That is all." He nodded once and went back to his phone, and I turned back to the water, and I let myself go back to the beginning. I was 32 years old when I started Sterling Global. I had $7,000, a second-hand welding torch, and a lease on a quarter of a dock that a retired shipbuilder named George Maitland was willing to rent me for $400 a month because he said I reminded him of himself 30 years earlier, and he wanted to see what I would do with it. I worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, 7 days a week, and I ate whatever I could afford, and I slept on a cot in the back office because I could not yet afford the apartment and the dock lease at the same time. My wife Catherine came to that dock every Friday evening with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She would sit on an overturned crate and watch me work, and sometimes she would read, and sometimes she would simply watch the water, and she never once told me it was too much or asked me when it would get easier. She had a quality I have never found in another person, a perfect, steady faith that did not require reassurance. She simply believed we would make it the way some people believe in gravity. It never occurred to her to question it. Caleb was born in the spring of our 4th year. I held him in the delivery room with grease still under my fingernails despite 3 rounds of scrubbing. And I remember thinking that he was the most astonishing thing I had ever seen. and that I would do anything, absolutely anything, to make sure the world was kind to him. Catherine died 22 months later. A brain aneurysm, sudden and total, on an ordinary Tuesday morning while Caleb was eating cereal in his high chair. She was 31 years old. I drove to the hospital, and a doctor I had never met told me she was gone, and I sat in a plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic, and I pressed my hands flat against my thighs to stop them from shaking, and I thought about my son sitting at home with the babysitter, waiting for one of his parents to come back. I drove home. I lifted Caleb out of his high chair. He laughed and grabbed my collar with both fists the way he always did, and pressed his forehead against mine and said, "Dada," in the particular tone he used when he was pleased to see me, and I held him against my chest, and I breathed in the smell of his hair, and I made him a promise I never spoke out loud, but have kept every day since. I will not let you fall. Whatever it costs me, I will not let you fall. For 7 years, that promise was easy to keep. Caleb was a serious, bright, affectionate boy who followed me to the dock on weekends and asked questions about everything and fell asleep in the truck on the way home with his head against the window. On the morning of his 7th birthday, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside was a note in his careful block letters and a small wooden boat he had carved himself from a piece of scrap timber, painted dark blue with the name Sterling on the hull. The note said, "After this I will build big ships so you never have to work this hard again." My chest tightened so sharply I had to sit down. I read the note 3 times. Then I walked to the small fireproof safe I kept in the back office, placed the boat inside, and locked it. I told myself I was keeping it safe. What I was actually doing was keeping it close, the way you keep the things you are most afraid of losing. I kept that boat in the safe for 31 years. I kept it there through every expansion, every acquisition, every contract we won, and every one we lost. I kept it there through Caleb's graduation and his first day at the company and his wedding to a woman whose eyes, when she looked at my son, reminded me of a person calculating the square footage of a room she intended to redecorate. I kept it there through 5 years of watching my son slowly become someone I recognized less and less with every passing Sunday. "Arthur." Harrison's voice came from across the seat. 20 minutes. I pulled my eyes away from the harbor. "All right," I said, and straightened up and let the memory go. "Let's begin." I spent 30 years reading contracts for a living, and the most important thing I learned in those 30 years is that the most dangerous language is never the language that sounds threatening. It is the language that sounds perfectly reasonable right up until the moment it destroys you. Isabella Belmont walked through my front door on a Sunday evening in October, wearing a cream-colored dress and a smile that reached her eyes exactly as far as she had calculated it needed to reach. Caleb had his hand on the small of her back, and his chin slightly lifted the way he used to stand as a boy when he was proud of something and wanted me to notice. "Dad," he said, "this is Isabella." She extended her hand and said, "Mr. Sterling, I have heard so many wonderful things about you." And her voice was warm, and her grip was firm, and she looked directly at me when she spoke, which most people consider a sign of honesty. I have negotiated enough contracts to know it is also the first technique you learn when you want someone to trust you quickly. I shook her hand and smiled and said, "Welcome to the house, Isabella." And I meant it because she was Caleb's choice, and Caleb's happiness was the only thing I had ever truly cared about building. I was wrong to mean it, but I did not know that yet. The Belmont family had what I have always thought of as inherited confidence, the particular ease of people who have never had to earn the room they walk into. Her father, a silver-haired man named Richard Belmont, who wore his wealth like a second suit, shook my hand at dinner 2 weeks later and said, "Arthur Sterling, the shipbuilder." Remarkable what a man can do starting from nothing, in a tone that made starting from nothing sound faintly embarrassing. Her mother smiled at everything I said, with the patient, slightly glazed expression of someone waiting for a less interesting conversation to end. I watched all of this. I filed it away. And I told myself that Isabella was not her parents, and that Caleb was a grown man capable of making his own choices, and that my job was to support him, not to audit his heart. For the first year, I almost convinced myself I was right. But I have always been better at reading people than I am at pretending I have not read them. And what I read in Isabella Belmont during that first year was a woman who had looked at my son and seen not a person she loved, but a position she intended to occupy. She laughed at his jokes a half-second too late. She touched his arm in public with the deliberate care of someone managing an impression. And when she looked at me beneath the warmth and the careful eye contact, there was a quality I recognized from 30 years of boardrooms, the look of a person who has already decided what something is worth and is simply waiting for the right moment to make their move. The change in Caleb came slowly enough that I could almost believe it was not happening. It began with small things. He started arriving late to Monday morning meetings without explanation, which he had never done before. He began ordering things for his office furniture equipment renovations without submitting the standard approval requests. He stopped asking my opinion on contracts he once would have brought to me automatically, and when I offered it anyway, he received it with a new flatness in his expression that he tried to disguise as attentiveness. Then one evening, I walked past the study in my house where Caleb was on the phone, and I heard Isabella's voice through the speaker, low and unhurried, and absolutely certain of itself. "His money should already be yours, Caleb," she was saying. "Every dollar he makes you beg for is a dollar he's using to keep you on a leash. You built half of what that company is today. You know that. Everyone who matters knows that." My hand tightened on the doorframe. My stomach dropped the way it does when you are reviewing a contract, and you find the clause that was designed to ruin you, not with anger, but with the cold, nauseating clarity of understanding exactly what you are dealing with. Caleb's voice came back lower. "It's not that simple, Bella. He built it from nothing. I can't just—" "You are not taking anything from him," Isabella said, and her voice sharpened by precisely 1 degree. "You are simply claiming what is already yours. There is a difference. Think about it." I stepped back from the doorway. My chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with my ribs. I walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood at the window watching the street outside while the water heated, and I thought about my son's voice. The slight hesitation, the way he had started to say something true, and stopped himself. He had not agreed with her. But he had not pushed back either. 3 weeks later, I received the first bank notification on my personal secure line. A wire transfer from the shadow fund account I had established 8 years earlier precisely for the purpose of documentation. $1.2 million. Destination Belmont Family Holdings, LLC. I stood in my study and read the notification twice. Then I picked up the phone and called Harrison Pike. "It has started," I said. "How much?" Harrison asked. 1.2, I said. "First transfer." There was a brief pause on the line, and then Harrison said in the quiet voice he uses when something is serious, "Do you want me to stop it?" "No," I said. "I want you to record it. Every single one." Harrison Pike has been my attorney for 30 years, and in that time, I have called him at unreasonable hours on more occasions than either of us would care to count. He has never once answered the phone with anything other than complete alertness, as though he keeps himself in a permanent state of readiness for exactly the kind of news that cannot wait until morning. It is one of the qualities I have valued most in him. The night I called him, after intercepting Isabella's phone call, it was 11:43. He answered on the second ring. "Harrison," I said, "I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning, early, and bring the reputation protection agreement that Caleb signed when he took the director position." There was a brief pause. "The standard onboarding package," Harrison said carefully. "That is what Caleb believes it is," I said. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. Then Harrison said, 7 o'clock, 6:30, I said. "And Harrison, do not mention this call to anyone." He arrived at 6:28 with 2 coffees and his leather briefcase, and the particular expression he wears when he already understands more than he has been told. We sat at my kitchen table as the sun came up over the harbor, and I told him everything I had seen over the previous 18 months. And when I was finished, he set his coffee down very carefully and looked at me across the table. "You built the shadow fund before any of this started," he said. It was not a question. "I built it 8 years ago," I said. "The week after Caleb told me he was serious about Isabella Belmont, I had a feeling I hoped I was wrong about." Harrison nodded slowly. "And the reputation protection agreement?" "Was never standard," I said. "You wrote it. You know exactly what is in it." He opened his briefcase and laid the document on the table between us. 4 pages, dense with legal language, the kind of language that looks routine to anyone who has not spent decades learning to read it. Caleb had signed it on his first day as director, along with 11 other documents in a session that lasted 40 minutes. I know because I timed it. He had not read a single page. Clause 7. Harrison said, turning to the 3rd page and setting his finger beneath a paragraph. "Gross misconduct. Any act of physical violence, verbal assault, or conduct materially damaging to the reputation of Sterling Global or its leadership committed by a senior officer constitutes grounds for immediate termination without notice or severance." "And Clause 12, I said. "Shikake, clawback provision." Harrison's voice was professionally flat, the way it gets when he is reading something with real consequences attached to it. "In the event of termination for gross misconduct, the company reserves the right to pursue recovery of all bonuses, equity grants, and financial benefits disbursed to the terminated officer within the preceding 5 years through civil litigation, if necessary." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. Outside, a container ship was moving slowly through the harbor channel, its running lights reflecting in long, broken lines across the water. "He has been drawing from the shadow fund for 8 years, I said. "Every transaction documented, every transfer recorded, every disbursement traceable to Belmont Family Holdings or to Isabella's personal accounts. The moment he commits a terminable offense, we file the civil suit under Clause 12 and present every document as evidence of the pattern of financial misconduct that preceded the termination." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Arthur, the shadow fund. You let him believe he was stealing from you." "I let him believe he was stealing from me," I confirmed, "because I needed him to keep going long enough to build a complete record. If I had stopped him at the first transfer, I would have had grounds to terminate him for financial misconduct, but nothing large enough to pursue full recovery. I needed the full picture." Harrison pressed his lips together. "And you never once considered simply talking to him?" The question landed in my chest, like a stone dropped into deep water. I felt the ripple of it move through me, and I breathed through it before I answered. "I talked to him every Sunday over a bowl of soup he cooked for me," I said. "I looked him in the eye every single week, and I gave him every opportunity to stop. He did not stop, Harrison. He got worse. There comes a point where a father has to accept that his love for his child cannot override his responsibility to the truth." Harrison picked up his pen. He did not argue. That is another thing I have always valued in him. He understands the difference between a decision that needs to be questioned and a decision that has already been made. We spent the next 4 hours restructuring the trust documents and updating the beneficiary designations. When we were finished, Harrison gathered the papers into a neat stack and secured them with a clip, and then he paused with his hand resting on top of the pile and looked at me. "There is one name here I was not expecting," he said. "Aiden Reeves," I said. Harrison's expression shifted by a fraction. "Who is Aiden Reeves?" I stood up and carried my empty cup to the sink. Outside the window, the harbor was fully lit, now the morning shift beginning on the docks below. "That," I said, "is a conversation for another day. But make sure the trust is airtight, Harrison. That child is the entire point of everything. The story is now reaching truths beyond imagination. To let me know you're still standing with Arthur in this battle, please comment on the number 1 below. And please note, the following scenes contain certain fictional elements to heighten the drama. If you feel this is not for you, you may stop the video right here. But if you're ready, let's begin the most brutal chapter. This was 2 years before the night of the gala. Aiden was 3 years old the first time I drove to Providence, and I want to tell you how that visit happened, because it is the part of this story that made everything else worth doing. There are things a father knows about his son that the son does not know he has revealed. The way Caleb used to say Elena's name in the 2 years before he met Isabella quickly, with a slight drop in his voice at the end. The way people say the names of things they are trying not to want told me more than any conversation we ever had on the subject. He had dated Elena Reeves for 3 years in his late 20s. She was a school teacher from Providence, Rhode Island, the daughter of a carpenter and a woman who ran a small bakery on the east side of town. She had dark hair and a directness about her that I had always found refreshing, and on the 2 occasions I met her, she had looked at me the way people look at you when they are genuinely interested in what you think rather than in what you own. I liked her immediately. I liked her in the uncomplicated way you like the people who are exactly who they appear to be. Caleb left her for Isabella Belmont in the spring, 10 months after Richard Belmont had invited him to a charity dinner at the Harbor Club and introduced him to his daughter. I do not know precisely what was said at that dinner. I know only that Caleb came home from it with a new quality in his eyes, a brightness that was not happiness, but ambition, and that 6 months later he told me he and Elena had parted ways, and that 3 months after that he brought Isabella through my front door. I did not hear Elena Reeves's name again for 2 years. The person who told me was a woman named Patricia Holloway, a retired nurse who had worked at the same Providence Elementary School where Elena taught and who attended the same church as a woman in my accounting department. The chain of connection was long and unlikely, and I have thought since that if any single link in it had been different, I might never have known. Patricia Holloway told my accountant's friend, who told my accountant, who came to me directly because she had worked for me for 19 years and understood that certain kinds of information needed to go to the top. What she told me was this: Elena Reeves had been pregnant when Caleb left her. She had not told him. She had moved back to Providence, had the baby alone, and had been raising the child by herself for the past 2 years, without asking anyone for anything. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything with it. I turned it over the way you turn over a problem that has more dimensions than it first appears to have. And at the end of 3 days, I got in my car on a Saturday morning and drove to Providence alone, without telling Harrison, without telling anyone. Elena Reeves opened her front door and looked at me, and I watched the recognition move across her face. She knew who I was, followed immediately by a wariness that pulled her shoulders back and lifted her chin by precisely half an inch. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was level, but her hand tightened on the doorframe. "I was not expecting you." "I know," I said. "I apologize for coming without notice. I will leave immediately if you ask me to. But I would like to talk if you are willing." She studied me for a long moment. Her eyes were dark and steady and gave nothing away, and I thought that whatever else Caleb had thrown away when he left this woman, he had thrown away someone with considerably more backbone than he deserved. "You can come in," she said finally. "But I want you to understand something before you do. I am not interested in money, Mr. Sterling. I am not interested in arrangements or agreements or anything that comes with conditions attached. If that is why you are here, you can turn around right now, and we will both pretend this did not happen." "That is not why I am here," I said. She held the door open, and I stepped inside. The house was small and clean, and full of the particular warmth of a home that is genuinely lived in children's drawings, pinned to the refrigerator, a pair of small sneakers by the door, a stack of picture books on the coffee table with a stuffed elephant balanced on top. It smelled of coffee and crayons and something baking in the kitchen, and standing in that hallway, I felt a tightness in my throat that caught me completely off guard. I heard him before I saw him. A small voice from the kitchen, high and clear, asking whether the cookies were ready yet. Elena called back that they needed 5 more minutes, and then a small boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, 3 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples, and his mother's steady dark eyes, and a smear of what appeared to be chocolate on his left cheek. He looked at me without any of the shyness most small children show with strangers. He simply looked with the frank, unhurried curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend he is not looking. "Are you the man who builds ships?" he asked. "Mom has a picture of a ship in her room." My throat closed so completely that for a moment I could not have spoken if my life depended on it. I crouched down to his level, and my knees ached with the effort, and I looked at my grandson for the first time, and I felt something shift in my chest that I did not have a name for, yet something vast and quiet and entirely new. I managed. "My name is Arthur." He considered this with great seriousness. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and said, "I'm Aiden. Do you want to see the boat I made?" Behind him, I heard Elena draw a slow breath. I looked up at her over Aiden's head, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, but was close enough that she pressed her lips together and looked away toward the window. "I would like that very much," I told my grandson. "I would like that more than almost anything. I want to tell you something about performance. Every great performer knows that the hardest role to sustain is not the villain and not the hero. It is the audience member. The person who watches everything, reacts to nothing, and gives no indication whatsoever that they know the show is a show. I played that role for 5 years at my own kitchen table every Sunday evening, and I want you to understand that it was the most difficult thing I have ever done. More difficult than building the company. More difficult than burying my wife. More difficult even than lying on the floor of a ballroom with my son standing over me. Because at least on that ballroom floor, I was allowed to feel what I felt. Caleb began cooking Sunday dinners for me the winter after he married Isabella, and he was good at it in the particular way of people who learn to cook as an act of love and never lose the instinct even after the love has changed into something else. He made the soup my mother used to make a thick navy bean and ham soup that takes 4 hours if you do it properly. And he brought it to the table in the blue ceramic pot Catherine had bought at a market in Annapolis the year before she died. The first time he set that pot on the table, my chest tightened painfully. I did not think he remembered where it had come from. I was not certain even that he knew, but I smiled and said, "That smells exactly right." And he smiled back with something genuine in it. Something that reminded me of the boy he used to be, and for one suspended moment I thought perhaps I was wrong about everything. Then his phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it, and the genuine thing in his expression was replaced by something careful and managed, and I understood that the moment was over. That was how it went every Sunday for 47 weeks. He would arrive at 6, cook the soup, set the table, ask about the business in the precise way of someone who has rehearsed the question to sound casual, and I would answer in the precise way of someone who has rehearsed the answer to sound forthcoming. We were two people performing a relationship for an audience of each other, and we were both in our separate ways very good at it. What Caleb did not know was that while he was performing the devoted son at my kitchen table, I was receiving real-time notifications on a secure device in my jacket pocket. The shadow fund, the one Harrison and I had built precisely for this purpose, was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. I watched every transaction, 300,000 to Belmont Family Holdings in February, $500,000 to an offshore account registered to a shell company Isabella's father had established in the Cayman Islands in April, $280,000 to a property developer in Miami in June for a condominium that appeared in Isabella's name the following month. Each transfer arrived on my secure device as a notification within minutes of execution, and each one I forwarded directly to Harrison's encrypted server without response. I did not confront Caleb. I did not slow walk the account to limit his access. I let him take what he took, because every dollar he moved was another page of evidence, and I needed the complete document, not a fragment of it. What it cost me to sit across from him every Sunday and watch him refill my bowl and ask whether I wanted more bread, that is something I will not try to put a number on. On the 47th Sunday, 11 days before the gala, Caleb arrived 20 minutes early. He was in a good mood, an expansive electric mood that he was working to contain, and I recognized it immediately as the mood of a man who believes he is very close to getting what he wants. He moved around my kitchen with a looseness in his shoulders that had not been there in months, and he talked more than usual about a shipping contract we had just closed, about a trip he and Isabella were planning, about a renovation they were considering for the Belmont estate in Connecticut. He set the soup on the table and lifted the ladle and filled my bowl first, the way he always did, and then he looked up at me and grinned a wide-open grin that split his face the way it used to when he was 7 years old and had just done something he was proud of. "You look good, Dad," he said. "You seem relaxed." My heart contracted so sharply I had to press my back teeth together to keep my expression steady. Because he meant it. In that moment, my son genuinely thought I was happy, and he was glad of it. And underneath the greed and the manipulation and the 5 years of calculated betrayal, there was still somewhere a thread of the boy who had carved a boat out of scrap timber and told me he would build big ships. "I feel good," I said, and picked up my spoon. "Best soup you have made in months, Caleb." He laughed and said, "I used more ham this time," and sat down across from me, and we ate together in the warm light of the kitchen, and I thought 11 more days. 11 more days, and I will never have to perform this particular role again. The gala was in 11 days. Harrison had everything prepared. All I needed was for Caleb to walk onto that stage and be exactly who he had spent 5 years becoming. I did not have to wait long. I have attended hundreds of formal events in my life. Dinners, galas, ceremonies, shareholder meetings dressed up as celebrations. And I have learned that the way a room feels in the hour before something significant happens is different from the way it feels on ordinary evenings. There is a quality to the air, a particular kind of charged stillness, like the atmosphere before a storm that has not yet decided where it intends to land. I felt it the moment I stepped out of the elevator into the Harborview Ballroom on the 40th anniversary of Sterling Global, and I knew with the certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime trusting his instincts that tonight was going to be the night. I had worn my best suit. Dark charcoal custom, made the one Catherine had always said, made me look like someone who had built something worth keeping. I straightened my tie in the elevator mirror before the doors opened, and I thought very briefly about the last time I had worn this suit, my wife's funeral 36 years ago, and I thought that Catherine would have found a grim humor in the symmetry of it. She had always appreciated a well-timed irony. The ballroom occupied the entire 32nd floor of the harbor view, with floor-to-ceiling windows running the length of the eastern wall, and the lights of Baltimore Harbor spread out below like a second constellation. The room held 400 people comfortably, and tonight it held exactly 400. Every seat at every table filled every significant name in the maritime industry and the broader Baltimore business community present, along with 3 television crews and no fewer than a dozen journalists from trade publications and general press. I had arranged for comprehensive media coverage myself. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the kind of witnesses whose job it is to record things accurately. The event coordinator, a brisk young woman named Sandra, who had been managing Sterling Global's formal events for 6 years, met me at the elevator with a tablet and a smile and a question about the evening's running order. I told her everything was proceeding as planned and thanked her for her work, and she went back to her tablet, and I moved into the room. I found my table front and center, as befitting the founder, and I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I stood at the edge of the room, and I took a slow inventory of everything I needed to know. Harrison Pike was already in position. He was seated at a table near the southeast corner of the room, close enough to the main floor to move quickly if needed, far enough from the head table to avoid drawing attention. His briefcase was on the floor beside his chair, and he was speaking with the couple seated next to him, with the relaxed ease of a man attending a pleasant social occasion, which is precisely what he wanted everyone around him to believe. He caught my eye across the room for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. That was all the communication we needed. The Sterling Global media team had set up 3 camera positions, one at the back of the room, covering the full floor, one on a raised platform to the left of the stage, capturing the head table, and one mounted on a track along the right wall for close coverage of the podium. All 3 were feeding to a live stream that was at this moment being watched by approximately 12,000 people on the company's digital channels. I had personally approved the streaming setup 2 weeks earlier. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that nothing that happened in that room later was undocumented. Every angle was covered. Every word spoken near a microphone was recorded. I had not arranged this for the purpose of what came later. The stream was a legitimate part of the anniversary celebration, but I had not arranged the evening without considering its possibilities. The Belmont family arrived as a group at 7:40, 20 minutes after the formal start time, which told me everything I needed to know about how they had decided to frame the evening. Late enough to make an entrance. Early enough to claim it was not intentional. Richard Belmont came through the door, first silver-haired and broad-shouldered, in a dinner jacket that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with his wife Margaret on his arm and 2 of their associates behind them. They moved into the room with the practiced ease of people who have spent their entire lives believing that rooms belong to them by default. Isabella came next in a floor-length gown the color of deep water. Her dark hair swept up at the back of her neck. Her posture so precisely correct, it looked almost architectural. She was, I will say, without qualification, a genuinely striking woman. I have never disputed that. What I have always disputed is the use she made of it. Caleb was beside her, his hand at her elbow, his dinner jacket perfectly fitted, his hair combed back from his face with the careful neatness of a man who has checked his appearance more than once tonight. He looked confident. He looked, in fact, more confident than I had seen him look in years, with a brightness in his eyes, and a set to his jaw that I recognized as the expression of someone who has decided that tonight is the night everything changes. He was right about that, at least. They moved to the head table where their names were on the place cards, and Caleb pulled Isabella's chair out for her with the automatic courtesy of a man performing the gestures of a good husband, and she sat and touched his arm briefly and said something in his ear that made him straighten slightly and nod. I watched all of this from my position near the front of the room, and I felt nothing that resembled anger. What I felt was something closer to a profound and exhausted sadness, the sadness of a man watching a fire he has been unable to prevent finally reach the thing he had hoped it would spare. The first course was served. The room settled into the comfortable noise of 400 people eating and talking and conducting the pleasant surface business of a formal celebration. I ate my soup. I made conversation with the shipping executives on either side of me. I laughed at 2 jokes I barely heard. Then somewhere between the salad course and the main, I watched Caleb reach into the inside pocket of his dinner jacket and withdraw a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table beside his plate and smoothed it flat with one hand, and then he looked up and across the room, not at me, but at his father-in-law, and Richard Belmont gave him a single, small, deliberate nod. Caleb's jaw tightened. He picked up his water glass. He took a long drink. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up, and the movement was measured and deliberate and carried with it the weight of something that had been planned for a very long time. He reached for the microphone on the podium at the head of the table. The room began to quiet around him, table by table, the way rooms do when someone with authority or the convincing appearance of it demands attention. He unfolded the paper slowly, with the careful hands of a man who has rehearsed this moment so many times it has become a kind of ceremony. Then he looked up at the room, and his eyes swept across 400 faces, and he smiled the smile of a man who believes the game is already over. I looked at my son standing at that podium, and I thought of a 7-year-old boy with a carved wooden boat and a note that said he would build big ships so I would never have to work hard again. And I thought of what I was about to have to do. And then I picked up my water glass and waited. Caleb cleared his throat, and the room finished quieting. And 400 people turned their faces toward the podium at the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice came out strong and clear and amplified by the room's sound system into every corner. "Thank you for being here tonight to celebrate 40 years of Sterling Global. 40 years of ships, of contracts, of growth that has made this company one of the most respected names in maritime industry on the eastern seaboard." There was a warm, genuine ripple of applause from around the room. I joined it. I clapped my hands together 4 times and kept my expression pleasant and attentive. And the man to my left leaned over and said, "Hell of a company you built, Arthur." And I said, "Thank you, David," and continued watching my son. Caleb waited for the applause to subside, and then he smiled, and the smile shifted into something different from the warm, professional expression he had been wearing a moment before. It became something sharper, something private. The smile of a man stepping out from behind a curtain he has been standing behind for a long time. 40 years is a long time, he said. And with 40 years comes the need for change, for evolution, for new vision and new leadership that can take everything my father built and carry it into the next generation. The room's temperature changed. It was not anything visible or audible. The people nearest me did not move. The lighting did not shift. But I have sat in enough rooms to feel when the air in one of them changes quality, and it changed then. A careful attention settled over the 400 people in that ballroom, the particular attention of people who have just realized that what they are watching may not be what they were told they were coming to see. "As of this evening," Caleb said, and he straightened to his full height and looked out across the room with the expression of a man planting a flag. "I am formally assuming the role of Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global. effective immediately. He turned his eyes to me then, and his voice dropped by half a register. You're finished, Dad. This company is mine now. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the Belmont table erupted into applause. Richard Belmont clapping with the vigorous enthusiasm of a man whose investment has just paid off. Margaret Belmont smiling her glazed, patient smile, the two associates beside them following suit with slightly less certainty. The sound of their applause in the middle of 400 people's stunned silence was one of the loneliest sounds I have ever heard in a room full of people. No one else clapped. I set my water glass down on the table. I folded my napkin and laid it beside my plate. I pushed my chair back and stood up, and as I rose, I felt the eyes of the room shift toward me like a compass finding north, and I buttoned my jacket and walked toward the stage with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who has been walking toward this moment for 10 years and sees no reason to rush it now. Caleb watched me come. The confidence in his face did not disappear immediately. It was too well constructed for that, but something moved behind his eyes. A flicker. The first hairline crack in the certainty. "Dad!" he said into the microphone, and his voice carried an edge of warning wrapped in the language of greeting. I heard you, Caleb, Somb," I said. I had reached the podium. I extended my hand toward the microphone, not grabbing, not demanding, simply waiting with the patient expectation of a man who knows the object will be handed to him. After a moment that stretched itself very thin, Caleb stepped back and I stepped forward. I looked out at 400 faces. I recognized most of them. I had shaken most of their hands, signed contracts, with many of them spent decades building the relationships that filled this room. I felt looking at them a strange and clarifying calm, the calm that comes when you have been preparing for something long enough that the moment of it feels less like an emergency and more like an arrival. "Good evening," I said. "I want to thank my son for his enthusiasm, and I want to address what he has just said directly, because I believe everyone in this room deserves clarity rather than confusion." I paused and let the silence hold for exactly long enough. "Sugiko, what Caleb has just announced is not legally possible," I said. "Sterling Global is held within a private trust, of which I am the sole trustee. The chairmanship and the chief executive position cannot be assumed by any individual without the written authorization of the trust countersigned by the trust's legal administrator. No such authorization exists. No such document has been signed. What Caleb has described tonight is not a transition of leadership. It is a unilateral declaration with no legal standing whatsoever." The room was absolutely still. I could hear the faint sound of the harbor through the building's ventilation system 32 floors below. "I want to be clear," I continued, "that I bear no ill will toward my son for his ambitions. Ambition is not a flaw, but ambition exercised without legal foundation, announced publicly without authorization before the press and before our partners and before every significant relationship this company has spent 40 years building, that is a different matter entirely. That is a matter I intend to address through the appropriate channels beginning tonight." I looked at Caleb, then directly the way I used to look at him when he was a boy and had done something he knew was wrong and was waiting to find out what the consequences would be. His face had gone very pale. His jaw was working. His hands, I noticed, were gripping the sides of the podium with a force that had whitened his knuckles. "Ah, Dad," he said, and his voice had dropped to something lower and rougher, stripped of the polished confidence he had walked into the room wearing. "Dad, you don't understand what you are doing." "I understand exactly what I am doing," I said quietly. The question, Caleb, is whether you understand what you have already done. He stared at me. His chest was heaving. Behind him I could see Isabella at the head table, perfectly still, her hand pressed flat against the tablecloth. Her eyes moving between her husband and her father with the rapid calculation of someone running numbers that are not adding up the way they were supposed to. Richard Belmont had stopped clapping. Caleb's hand tightened on the podium until I thought the wood might crack under it. His eyes filled with something wet and furious and humiliated, and his voice, when it came, had changed into something I had never heard from him before. Something raw and ugly and past the point of caring what it sounded like. "You want to talk about what I understand," he said. "Fine. Let's talk about what I understand. Let's talk about what it has been like being your son." What Caleb said next, I will tell you exactly. I will not soften it or summarize it or protect you from it, because the truth of what happened in that room deserves to be recorded precisely, and because I have found that the things we are most tempted to smooth over are usually the things that most need to be seen clearly. He took the microphone back. His hand was shaking as he gripped it, trembling with the particular violence of a man who has been holding something in for a very long time and has finally decided to let it go. "Do you know what it is like?" he said, and his voice cracked on the second word and then steadied into something hard and cold. "To grow up as Arthur Sterling's son, to have every single thing you do measured against the legend of what he built from nothing. Every grade, every decision, every relationship, all of it weighed on the scale of whether it was good enough for the great Arthur Sterling and his great company." The room did not move. 400 people stood or sat exactly where they were, and no one spoke, and the only sound was Caleb's amplified voice and the faint electric hum of the sound system, carrying it into every corner. "I gave this company 10 years of my life," he said. 10 years. And every morning I walked into that building, I was not the director or the CEO or the son who was carrying on his father's legacy. I was the boy who had not yet proven he deserved to be there. Do you have any idea what that does to a man? His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed his lips together and breathed hard through his nose. I kept my eyes on my son's face. My chest ached with a pain so profound, it was almost peaceful, the way extreme cold eventually stops feeling like cold and becomes something else entirely. I did not interrupt him. I let him speak because he needed to speak, and because every word he said was being recorded by 3 cameras and 12 journalists and 400 witnesses. "And you want to talk about legal standing?" Caleb's voice rose sharply edged with something close to hysteria. "You want to talk about documents and trusts and clauses? That is all you have ever had, isn't it? Papers, contracts, legal language? You built a company, and you lost a wife, and you raised a son, and every single piece of it was managed like a transaction. Did you ever even once just be my father without it being about the company?" He was crying now. The tears were running freely down his face, and he was not trying to stop them, and part of me, the part that would always be the man who held him in a delivery room with grease under his fingernails, felt those tears like a blade between my ribs. Then he said the thing about his mother is, "Do you know why she died?" His voice dropped to something low and vicious and deliberate. "Not the medical reason. The real reason. She died because living with you was slowly suffocating her. Because you turned everything into a balance sheet. She didn't die of an aneurysm, Dad. She died to get away from you. And honestly," he laughed a short, broken, ugly sound. "Can you blame her? The pain that moved through me then was not like anything I can accurately describe. It started somewhere behind my sternum and spread outward through my chest and down my arms until my hands went briefly cold, and for 3 full seconds I could not have spoken if the room had been on fire. But then I thought of Catherine. I thought of her face in that hospital bed in the last hours, and I thought of what she had actually said to me, and I felt something straighten inside my spine like a rod of iron being heated and reset. "Caleb," I said, and my voice was quiet enough that the room had to hold its breath to hear it. "Your mother's last words to me were not about escape. They were about you." She took my hand and she said, "Protect him from the Belmont blood, Arthur." She had never met Isabella. She had never met Richard Belmont. But she knew the way your mother always knew things before they happened, that the greatest danger to you would not come from outside this family. It would come from inside your own ambition. I paused. She loved you more than anything in the world, and she spent her last conscious moments worrying about exactly this. Caleb's face crumpled. For one terrible moment I thought he was going to collapse entirely, and something in me reached toward him. 30 years of fatherhood, reaching toward the boy underneath the man. And then I watched him do what he had been doing for 5 years whenever he felt something true. I watched him push it down and replace it with rage. "Shut up," he said. His voice was barely recognizable. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." "Caleb." I said, "Shut up." He moved toward me. I saw it happening, and I did not step back, because stepping back was not something I was willing to do. Not in this room, not in front of these people, not after everything. His hand came up, and I saw it in the fraction of a second before it connected, and I had time to think with a strange, detached clarity, so this is how it ends. The sound of it cracked through the ballroom like a starter pistol. My head snapped sideways. My glasses flew from my face, and I heard them hit the edge of the podium, and the lens shattered, and the momentum of the blow carried me backward, and my hip caught the corner of the speaker platform, and I went down hard, my shoulder hitting first, and then the side of my head against the polished floor, and the pain arrived all at once, like a wave breaking sharp and bright and total. I lay on the floor of my own ballroom in the company I had built from a borrowed dock and a second-hand torch, and I tasted blood on my lip, warm and iron-sharp, and the lights above me were very bright, and the room was absolutely silent. I turned my head and looked up at my son. Caleb stood over me with his hand still raised his chest, heaving his face soaked with tears and twisted with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something that was shame and fury and terror all compressed together into a single unbearable moment. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. I looked at my son, and my heart broke with a completeness I had not thought possible, and I thought with perfect clarity, it is done. Whatever we were to each other, it is done now. And what comes next is not about us anymore. It is about Aiden. It has always been about Aiden. "Harrison," I said. My voice was steady. It surprised me that it was steady, but it was. "Harrison, I need to get up now." Harrison reached me in the time it takes a man who has been waiting for something to finally happen to cross a room he has already mentally crossed 100 times. He went to one knee beside me without hesitation, his briefcase still in his left hand, his right hand finding my arm with a steadiness that told me he was not panicking, even if everything around us was. "Arthur." His voice was low and controlled, but I could hear the effort in it, the way you can hear the effort in a structure that is bearing more weight than it was designed for, but holding regardless. "Can you move everything?" I took a careful inventory. My shoulder ached with a deep grinding persistence that told me something had been wrenched, but not broken. My hip throbbed where it had caught the platform edge. My lip was split, and the blood was warm against my chin, and the taste of it was sharp and metallic at the back of my throat. The side of my head where it had connected with the floor pulsed with a bright, insistent pain that I suspected would become considerably worse before it became better. "That I can move everything," I said. "Help me up." He took my arm in both hands and I pressed my palm flat against the floor and pushed, and the effort sent a spike of pain through my shoulder that made my vision white briefly at the edges, and then I was upright, and Harrison's hand was at my elbow and I was standing. The room came back into full resolution. 400 faces turned toward me with the stunned collective stillness of people who have just witnessed something they cannot yet process. The cameras were still running. Every lens in the room was pointed at the stage. I was aware of all of this with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in the aftermath of pain, everything sharp-edged and hyper-real, the lights too bright, the sounds too distinct. I straightened my jacket. I reached up and adjusted my tie, centering it with 2 fingers, the way my father had taught me to do when I was 12 years old, and he was showing me how to dress for the kind of rooms he had never been allowed into. I smoothed the front of my jacket with one hand. I did not touch my lip. I did not reach for the remnants of my glasses. I left them where they had fallen because picking them up would have required bending down, and I was not going to bend down in that room tonight. Caleb had not moved. He was still standing at the edge of the stage, his hand lowered, now his face a ruin of tear tracks and shock and a dawning, terrible comprehension. His mouth was open slightly. His breathing was audible from where I stood, rapid and shallow, the breathing of a man whose body has registered what his mind has not yet caught up to. Isabella had risen from her seat at the head table. She was standing with both hands pressed flat against the tablecloth, her posture rigid, her eyes moving between Caleb and the room with the rapid, calculating focus of someone assessing damage in real time. She was not crying. She would not cry tonight. That was not the kind of woman she was. Richard Belmont had both hands flat on the table and was studying the surface of it with the concentrated attention of a man who has suddenly discovered an urgent interest in the grain of the wood. I looked at my son for a long moment. My chest ached with the full weight of 38 years. Every morning I had gotten up before dawn to go to the dock, so he would have a future every school play I had attended. Still smelling of machine oil every Sunday, I had sat across from him and eaten his soup and pretended not to know what he was doing to me. All of it was in that look. All of it, and the grief of it, and the love underneath the grief that I knew would not go away simply because tonight had happened. Caleb's chin trembled. His eyes filled again, fresh tears moving over the tracks of the ones that had already dried on his face. "Dad," he said, and the word came out destroyed. Hollow and small and entirely unlike the voice of the man who had stood at that podium 20 minutes ago with the confidence of a conqueror. "Dad, I don't know why I—" "Should you do know why?" I said. My voice came out quiet and level, and without any anger in it at all, which I think surprised him more than anything else that had happened tonight. "You know exactly why, Caleb, and so do I. And so does every person in this room." His face crumpled completely. A sound came out of him that I can only describe as the sound of something structural giving way, a sob wrenched up from somewhere deep and involuntary, the kind of sound that bypasses the will entirely and simply arrives. He pressed his fist against his mouth to stop it, and his shoulders shook with the effort of containment. I looked at him for one more moment. I let myself feel fully and without flinching exactly how much this hurt. I let the pain of it move through me completely because I have learned that the only way through grief is through it, and because I knew that after tonight, I would need to have already felt this in order to do what came next. Then I turned away from my son. "Harrison," I said. "Right here," he said, and he was exactly where he had been, his hand still at my elbow, his briefcase in his other hand, his face composed into the professional steadiness I had relied on for 30 years. We walked to the main doors together. I set my pace deliberately, not hurrying, not performing slowness, simply walking at the pace of a man who knows where he is going and is not afraid of arriving. Around me, I heard the room begin to breathe again, a collective exhalation that moved through 400 people like a wave, followed by the low, urgent sound of voices beginning to talk. The doors opened. The corridor was cool and quiet after the charged air of the ballroom. A hotel staff member standing near the elevator looked at me with wide eyes and started forward, and I shook my head once, and he stopped. We reached the elevator. Harrison pressed the button. The doors opened immediately, as though the building itself had been waiting. Inside, as the doors closed, Harrison opened his briefcase and looked at me across it. "The process servers are ready," he said. "The documents are prepared. Every team is standing by. I only need one word from you." I looked at my reflection in the polished elevator doors. A 72-year-old man in a charcoal suit, with a cut lip and no glasses, standing very straight, looking back at me with an expression I recognized as the one I had worn the morning I signed the founding documents of Sterling Global 40 years ago. The expression of a man who has made a decision he will not be reversing. Outside 32 floors below, I could hear the first faint wail of police sirens beginning to rise from the direction of the harbor. "Begin," I said. My study at home is not a large room. It holds a desk, 2 chairs, a wall of bookshelves, and a fireproof safe built into the wall behind a panel of oak that Catherine had picked out the year we moved in because she said it matched the color of the harbor at low tide. It is not the kind of room that looks like the headquarters of anything significant. But by the time Harrison and I arrived at 11:47 that night, it had become the most consequential room in Baltimore. Harrison set his briefcase on the desk and opened it, and the stack of documents inside was 3 inches thick, rubber-banded into separate sections with colored tabs that corresponded to a sequence we had mapped out and refined over the course of 10 years. Every document was signed. Every document was dated. Every document had been reviewed by Harrison's firm within the past 30 days to ensure it remained current, binding, and executable without delay. He looked at me across the desk. "Ready?" "Ready," I said. "Midnight sequence. In order?" Harrison picked up his phone and began to make calls. The first call went to the head of Sterling Global's Human Resources Department, a meticulous woman named Barbara Crane, who had been briefed 3 weeks earlier that she might receive a call from Harrison Pike at an unusual hour, and that if she did, she was to treat it as the highest priority matter the company had ever placed before her. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. "Ms. Crane." Harrison said, "This is Harrison Pike. I am transmitting the termination notice for Caleb Sterling now. The grounds are gross misconduct under Clause 7 of his employment agreement. The termination is effective as of 11:59 tonight. Please ensure that his system access, building access, and all associated credentials are revoked before midnight." There was a brief pause on the line, and then Barbara Crane said, in the level professional tone of a woman who has prepared for exactly this, "Understood, Mr. Pike. It will be done." Harrison ended the call and looked at me. "1," he said. "Next," I said. The second call went to Sterling Global's Fleet Operations Manager. Caleb had been using 2 company vehicles, a black Range Rover registered to the company's executive pool, and a Mercedes sedan assigned to his office, along with a Gulfstream G550 that the company leased and that Caleb had been using for personal travel at company expense for the past 3 years. Harrison had prepared formal asset recovery notices for all 3 compliant with Maryland vehicle and aviation regulations, requiring 48 hours written notice before physical recovery could proceed. The notices were transmitted electronically at 12:01, which meant recovery could begin in 48 hours. The vehicles would be gone by Thursday morning. I watched Harrison work with the particular admiration I have always felt for people who are genuinely excellent at what they do. He moved through the sequence with a calm, systematic precision that reminded me oddly of the way the best welders work: no wasted motion. No hesitation, every action placed exactly where it needs to be placed. At 12:30, Harrison filed the emergency civil lawsuit with the Baltimore City Circuit Court, seeking recovery of $450 million under the clawback provision of Caleb's employment agreement. The filing cited the video evidence of the assault, the termination notice, and 5 years of documented financial transfers from the Shadow Fund as the basis for the claim. An emergency motion for asset preservation, preventing Caleb from moving or liquidating any assets while the lawsuit was pending, was filed simultaneously and would be heard by a duty judge at 8 the following morning. "He will not be able to move a dollar," Harrison said, setting his phone down after the confirmation came through. "Not a cent. Every account we can identify is flagged for preservation." My chest tightened. Not with satisfaction, I want to be clear about that. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from doing something necessary that you wish had never become necessary, and that was what I felt at 12:30 in the morning, sitting in the room where I had read contracts and built a company, and occasionally, in the early years, slept on the floor because there was no time to drive home. I felt the weight of it like a physical thing pressing against my sternum. "Harrison," I said. He looked up from his laptop. "The scholarship fund," I said. "Make sure the annual disbursements are not affected by any of this. The children who receive those grants have nothing to do with tonight." Harrison's expression softened by a fraction, the smallest concession his professional composure ever allowed itself. "Already separated," he said. "The fund is in a completely independent trust. Nothing that happens tonight touches it." I nodded. "Good." At 2 in the morning, Harrison drafted the formal notification to Sterling Global's board of directors, informing them of Caleb's termination and the pending civil litigation and the appointment of an interim executive committee to manage operations until a permanent leadership structure could be confirmed. The notification went out at 2:15, and I knew that within the hour every board member's phone would be lighting up. At 3:45, I sat down at my desk and uncapped my pen and pulled the final document toward me. It was the trust amendment, the one that formally activated Aidan Reeves's position as the primary beneficiary of the Sterling Global Trust, with Harrison Pike named as independent administrator until Aidan's 25th birthday. I held the pen over the signature line, and I felt very suddenly, and with very little warning, the full weight of everything the evening had contained come down on me at once. The pain in my shoulder, the dried blood on my lip, the sound Caleb had made when the last of his certainty had given way. The image of my son's face destroyed and unrecognizable, and still underneath all of it, the face of the boy who had carved a boat and promised to build big ships. My hand trembled slightly over the page. Just once. Then I pressed my pen to the paper and signed my name in the deliberate, unhurried script I had used on every significant document of my life. And the thing was done. "That is everything," Harrison said quietly. I capped my pen and set it down and looked at the harbor through my study window. The sky over the water was beginning to lighten at its edge, not sunrise yet, but the first suggestion of it, the dark beginning to separate from the dark in the way it does in the hour before dawn, when the world is deciding whether to continue. "Go home, Harrison," I said. "Get a few hours of sleep. You have done good work tonight." He gathered his papers without argument. At the door he paused and looked back at me. "Arthur," he said. For what it is worth, I think you gave him every chance a man could give." I looked at the lightning harbor and said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "I know I did. That is the only part of this that does not hurt." Harrison closed the door behind him, and I sat alone in my study as Baltimore moved slowly toward morning, and I let myself feel everything I had been too busy to feel since the moment my son's hand had connected with my face, and it was a very long time before I moved again. I slept for 3 hours on the couch in my study, which is not something I would recommend to anyone, but which I have done enough times in my life that my body accepts it without complaint. When I woke at 7:15, the harbor was fully lit, and my shoulder had stiffened overnight into something that made putting on a fresh shirt a careful and unpleasant exercise. I made coffee. I sat at my desk, and I waited for Harrison's first report. He called at 7:42. "I am going to tell you what he told me, because I believe you deserve to know the full accounting of what that morning looked like." Harrison keeps detailed notes of everything. It is one of the qualities that has made him invaluable to me for 3 decades, and what follows is drawn from those notes and from the reports his process servers filed with the firm before noon. The process servers arrived at Caleb and Isabella's house in Roland Park at 7:03 in the morning. There were 2 of them, both experienced, both professional, carrying a sealed envelope that contained the termination notice, the civil lawsuit filing the asset preservation order, and a formal letter from Harrison's firm outlining Caleb's legal obligations and rights. They rang the doorbell twice. Caleb answered the door in the clothes he had worn the night before. He had not slept. His eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, his hair disheveled, his dinner jacket hanging open over a shirt that had come untucked. He looked, according to the process server's report, like a man who had been sitting in a dark room for several hours, waiting for something bad to arrive, and had not quite managed to prepare himself for it regardless. He took the envelope. He opened it on the doorstep. The process server reported that he read the first page twice, then the second, and then his hands began to shake so visibly that the papers rattled audibly in the morning quiet of the street. "This isn't right," he said, and his voice was hoarse and cracked at the edges. "This can't be right. There has to be a mistake." "Try it until there is no mistake, Mr. Sterling," the process server said. "You will find the contact information for the filing attorney on page 4. Caleb tried to call Harrison at 7:12. Harrison did not answer on my instructions because there was nothing left to negotiate, and I saw no purpose in prolonging what needed to be understood rather than argued. He tried his own attorney at 7:15. His attorney, a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had represented him on several business matters over the years, answered and listened, and then said with the careful precision of a man removing himself from a situation that the matter was significantly outside his area of expertise and that he would be referring Caleb to a litigation specialist. He did not call back. At 7:45, Caleb drove to Sterling Global's headquarters on Harbor Boulevard. His keycard, which had been deactivated by Barbara Crane at 11:59 the previous night, did not open the parking garage gate. He parked on the street and walked to the main entrance. The security guard on duty, a man named Robert, who had worked the morning shift for 11 years, and who knew Caleb by name and had always greeted him with genuine warmth, stepped forward as he approached the door. "Oh, Mr. Sterling," Robert said, and his voice was kind in the particular way of people who are doing something difficult and know it. "I'm sorry, sir. Your access has been revoked. I can't let you in." Caleb stared at him. "Robert," he said. "Robert, you know me. I've worked here for 10 years. "I know, sir," Robert said. "I'm sorry. I have my instructions." Caleb stood on the sidewalk outside the building he had walked into every morning for a decade, and according to the security log, he remained there for 11 minutes before getting back in his car. He drove home. What happened when he arrived is the part of the morning's accounting that Harrison relayed to me with the particular careful neutrality he uses when he is telling me something he knows will cause me pain. Isabella was in the living room when Caleb walked through the front door. She was dressed impeccably. This detail struck me when Harrison mentioned it, the deliberateness of it, the statement it made about how long she had been prepared for this morning. Beside her on the coffee table was a manila envelope and a phone, and standing near the fireplace was a man Harrison identified as Jonathan Voss, a family law attorney whose firm had offices on Charles Street. "Isabella," Caleb said, and his voice broke on her name, cracking open with a rawness that Harrison's source said was painful to hear. "Isabella, we need to talk. It's bad, Bella. It's really bad. But we can fix this. I can fix this. I just need you to—" "Caleb," Isabella said, and her voice was the voice I had heard through the speaker of his phone years ago, warm on the surface diamond underneath. "Stop." She picked up the manila envelope from the coffee table and held it out toward him. He looked at it without taking it. "What is that?" "Divorce papers," she said. "They were prepared 6 weeks ago. I have been waiting for the right moment." The sound Caleb made then was not a word. It was something underneath language, a sound of pure, unprocessed shock, the sound a person makes when the last structure they believed was holding collapses entirely. The process server, who remained on the front step until the formal receipt was acknowledged, reported that he reached for the wall beside the door to steady himself, and his hand missed it, and he stumbled slightly before catching his balance. "You knew," he said. "You knew this was going to happen." Isabella set the envelope on the side table nearest him. "Jonathan will explain the terms," she said. "They are straightforward. I am not asking for anything that isn't already mine." She picked up her phone and walked out of the room without looking back, and Jonathan Voss cleared his throat and said in the professional tone of a man who is simply doing his job, "Mr. Sterling, perhaps you would like to sit down." Caleb did not sit down. He walked back out the front door and sat on the top step of the front porch of the house he had believed was his, and according to the neighbor who called Harrison's office that afternoon to relay what she had seen, he sat there without moving for 45 minutes, his head in his hands, while the morning traffic moved past him on the quiet Roland Park Street. Harrison finished his report and then waited. "Thank you, Harrison," I said. My voice was steady. My chest was not. The pain behind my sternum was the particular pain of watching something you could not have prevented reach its inevitable end, and it is a pain I would not wish on anyone regardless of what they had done to deserve the morning they were having. "There is one more thing," Harrison said. "The district attorney's office called at 9 this morning. They have reviewed the video from the gala. They are moving forward with charges." I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the desk. "All right," I said. "Arthur?" "I know Harrison," I said. "I know." Harrison called again at 2:17 in the afternoon, and I knew from the quality of the pause before he spoke that what he was about to tell me was the part of the day's accounting that neither of us had been looking forward to. "The Baltimore Police Department made the arrest at 1:45, he said. "2 detectives from the Criminal Investigations Division. They went to the Roland Park address." He was still there. I put the phone down on the desk for a moment. Not to end the call, I kept the line open, but because I needed both hands free to press against the edge of the desk and breathe through what I was feeling, which was not the satisfaction of a man whose plan had succeeded, but the particular nauseating grief of a father watching the worst possible outcome of a story he had spent 10 years trying to prevent. I picked the phone back up. "Go ahead," I said. The charges Harrison explained were assault in the second degree, under Maryland Criminal Law Section 3-203, which covers intentional offensive physical contact, causing physical injury and abuse of a vulnerable adult under Section 3-604, given my age and the circumstances of the assault. The district attorney's office had reviewed the footage from all 3 cameras and determined that the evidence was unambiguous. There was no version of events, Harrison said, that the video did not directly contradict. I thought about Robert standing at the security door that morning, saying, "I'm sorry, sir," with the voice of a man doing something he found difficult. I thought about Barbara Crane answering her phone on the first ring at midnight, waiting in the dark for a call she had been told might come. I thought about all the people who had been watching my son for years, the way you watch a storm that is moving toward something you love, hoping it changes course, knowing it will not. How did he respond to the arrest? I asked. Harrison was quiet for a moment. According to the arresting officers, he did not resist. He asked if he could make a phone call first. They allowed it. He called Isabella's number. She did not answer. My eyes closed briefly. My throat tightened with a pain that had nothing to do with the cut on my lip. "But he asked about you." Harrison continued, and his voice was careful now, the way it gets when he is delivering information he is not certain I want. While they were processing him, he asked the duty officer if his father had been the one to file the complaint. What did the officer tell him? The truth. That the district attorney had initiated the charges independently based on the video evidence. That you had not filed a personal complaint. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window. The harbor was doing what it always does, moving indifferent constant. A tugboat was pushing a container ship slowly through the main channel, and the ship's wake spread outward in a long, gradual V that reached both banks and dissolved. "Where is he now?" I asked. "Central booking on Wabash Avenue," Harrison said. "He will be held overnight pending a bail hearing tomorrow morning." His court-appointed attorney, Gerald Forsyth, declined the case formally. At noon is a public defender named Angela Torres. She is apparently quite good. "Make sure she has everything she needs," I said. Harrison paused. "I'm sorry. If Caleb is going to have legal representation, I want it to be competent representation," I said. "Not because I am softening anything. The charges stand. The civil suit proceeds. But I will not have my son represented badly because the people who should have stood by him have already decided he is not worth their time. Arrange for an anonymous contribution to cover a private attorney if Ms. Torres agrees to take the case at that rate." There was a long pause on Harrison's end of the line. Long enough that I said, "Harrison." "I'll arrange it," he said, and his voice had something in it that it does not usually have. Something that sounded, if I am being accurate, like the sound a man makes when he has just been reminded why he has worked for someone for 30 years. We talked through the procedural details for another 20 minutes. The bail hearing, the civil suit timeline, the board notification responses that had been coming in all morning, the media coverage that had already begun spreading through the business press and the general news channels. The footage from the gala had been viewed by Harrison's count approximately 300,000 times by mid-afternoon, and that number was climbing. When we had covered everything that needed to be covered, Harrison said, "There is one more item. I have been holding it because I was not certain of the timing, but I think the timing is now." "Tell me," I said. "The photograph," Harrison said. "The one we discussed. Caleb's public defender has made contact with my office. Standard procedure, she is building her understanding of the case. She asked if there was anything I wanted her client to have. I turned away from the harbor window and looked at the photograph on my desk, a 5x7 print, taken 6 months earlier in Providence of a small boy in a red sweater, standing in front of a harbor with his face turned toward the water. Aiden's profile. his dark curling hair, his mother's chin, and in the set of his shoulders and the particular way he held his head when he was thinking about something, an echo of a man I had known for 72 years. I had been looking at that photograph every morning for 6 months. It had been the first thing I saw when I sat down at my desk, and the last thing I looked at before I left the room. "Send it," I said. "With a note from me. 1 sentence." "What sentence?" Harrison asked. I looked at the boy in the red sweater standing at the water's edge, and I thought about everything Caleb had thrown away and everything he had not yet understood he had lost. And I said, "Tell him this is what you gave up everything for. Not a company. Not a title. This." Harrison wrote it down. I heard his pen moving across the paper. "I'll have it delivered to the facility before 5, he said. "Good," I said. "And Harrison, call me when you have confirmation that he received it." I put the phone down and sat in my study as the afternoon light moved across the harbor, and I thought about my son sitting in a cell on Wabash Avenue reading a single sentence above a photograph of the child he had never known existed, and the pain of it was so large and so quiet that I sat with it for a very long time without moving the way you sit with things that are too heavy to carry but too important to put down. Angela Torres called Harrison at 4:58, 2 minutes before the deadline I had set, and Harrison called me immediately after. I was still at my desk. I had not left the study all afternoon, which tells you something about the state I was in, because I am not by nature a man who sits still. "She confirmed delivery," Harrison said. "He received the envelope at 4:30. She was present when he opened it." "Tell me," I said. Harrison read from his notes in the careful neutral tone he uses when the content of what he is reading is anything but neutral. Angela Torres had been sitting across from Caleb in the consultation room at Central Booking when the envelope arrived. He had not spoken much during their meeting. He had answered her questions in the minimal, mechanical way of a man whose mind is somewhere else entirely. And when the guard slid the envelope across the table, he had looked at it for a long moment without touching it, the way people look at things they are not sure they want to know. Then he picked it up and opened it. He looked at the photograph for a very long time. Angela Torres said she counted to 30 before he moved, and in those 30 seconds, his face went through something she described as the most complete emotional transformation she had witnessed in 15 years of criminal defense work. She said it began with confusion, the slight furrowing of his brows, the tilt of his head, and then moved through recognition, and then through something she could only describe as a man being hollowed out from the inside. His hands, she said, were shaking so badly by the time he finished reading my single sentence that the photograph rattled against the table when he set it down. "Who is this?" he asked. His voice, she reported, was barely above a whisper. "I believe that is information your father wanted you to have directly," she said carefully. Caleb looked at the photograph again. His throat moved. His eyes filled, and the tears that came were different from the ones he had shed on the stage. "How old?" he asked. Angela Torres looked at the back of the photograph where Harrison had written a single line of information at my instruction. 4 years old, she said. Caleb pressed both hands flat against the table. His jaw was clenched so tightly that Angela Torres said she could see the muscle working in his cheek. He breathed in through his nose twice, and then he said in a voice that was cracking apart at every seam, "Elena." It was not a question. It was the sound of a man placing a piece into a puzzle that has just revealed itself to be an entirely different picture from the one he thought he was assembling. I will tell you what I was thinking as Harrison read me this account, because I believe it is relevant. I was thinking about Elena Reeves at 28 years old, standing in a hospital corridor alone, making the decision to carry a child whose father had already chosen someone else, and choosing to do it without bitterness, without leverage, without any of the weapons that situation gave her and that a different person might have used. I was thinking about the 5 years she had spent in that small house in Providence, raising a boy with her mother's eyes and his father's jawline, teaching him to be kind and curious and unafraid, while his father spent those same 5 years hollowing himself out in the service of people who did not love him. He asked about her. Harrison continued. He asked if she was all right. He asked if she had needed anything. What did Torres tell him? She told him that to the best of her knowledge, Elena Reeves was well and self-sufficient, and that the child was healthy and thriving. Caleb had put his face in his hands at that point. Angela Torres sat with him without speaking, which I thought showed considerable professional wisdom, and after several minutes, he lifted his head and looked at the photograph again and said, "He looks like my father." I had to set the phone down again when Harrison said that. Just for a moment. Just long enough to press my fingers against my eyes and breathe through the tightening in my chest that came with the understanding that my son, in the worst moment of his life, sitting in a cell on Wabash Avenue with charges pending and everything gone, had looked at a photograph of his son and seen me. I picked the phone back up. "There is something else," Harrison said. Before Torres left, Caleb asked her to find out about a scholarship fund. He said he had seen the name on one of the civil suit documents. He wanted to know what the Caleb Sterling Aspiration Fund was. I looked at the harbor through my study window. A light rain had begun during the afternoon, and the water was dimpled with it, the surface broken into 1,000 small circles that appeared and disappeared and were replaced by new ones before the old ones had fully closed. "What did Torres say?" I asked. "She told him she would look into it," Harrison said. "She asked me about it when she called. I gave her the basic information, the fund's purpose, the beneficiaries, the annual disbursement schedule." He paused. "I also told her about your visits, the annual ones." "All right," I said. "Arthur," Harrison said, and his voice was careful. "She said that when she told him you visited the scholarship recipients every year personally, he asked her to stop. He said he needed to be alone for the rest of the afternoon. She honored that. I understood why. There are things a person needs to sit with in private realizations of a particular size and weight that cannot be processed with anyone watching. I had sat with enough of them myself to recognize the shape of one from a distance. "Harrison," I said, "tomorrow morning after the bail hearing, whatever the outcome, I want you to send Caleb one more document." "Which document?" "Stianimam. The founding charter of the scholarship fund," I said. "The original, the one with the date on it. I want him to see when I established it. The same night you called me about the reputation protection agreement," Harrison said quietly. "Yes," I said. "Exactly that night." There was a pause, and then Harrison said, "You want him to understand that you were building something with his name on it at the same time you were building the case against him." "I want him to understand," I said, "that I never stopped being his father. Not for a single day. Not even when I was doing what I had to do." Harrison said he would have it sent first thing in the morning. We ended the call, and I sat in my study as the rain moved across the harbor, and I thought about a boy in a red sweater standing at the water's edge, and about his father sitting in a cell 2 miles away, holding a photograph he did not know existed until today, and I felt the distance between those two things, like a physical weight across my shoulders. I established the Caleb Sterling Aspiration Fund on a Tuesday evening in October 10 years ago, in the same hour that I called Harrison Pike for the first time about the reputation protection agreement. I want you to understand the sequence of that evening, because the sequence matters. I had just gotten off the phone with Harrison after hearing the first bank notification. I had just confirmed for the first time that my son was stealing from me with the systematic patience of someone who believed he would never be caught. I had just made the decision to let him continue to document rather than confront, to build a case rather than have a conversation that I already knew in the part of myself that had been reading people for 40 years would change nothing. And then I sat at my desk in the silence after that call, and I thought about what it meant to have a son. Not what it meant legally or financially or in terms of succession planning. What it meant in the simplest, most irreducible sense. That there was a person alive in the world who carried your name and your blood and the shape of your hands, and that whatever he became, whatever he did, the fact of him was permanently woven into the fact of you. I could not save Caleb from what he was becoming. I understood that with a clarity that was like the clarity that comes after a fever breaks clean and cold and absolute. But I could take his name, the name Sterling, and do something worthy with it. I could make sure that somewhere in the world, that name meant what I had always intended it to mean when I gave it to him. The fund was simple in its structure. Each year, 10 scholarships were awarded to students from Baltimore's shipbuilding and maritime communities. The children of dock workers, welders, engineers, the trades that had built this industry from the waterline up. Priority was given to students who had lost a parent, because I understood what it was to grow up with that particular gap in the architecture of your life. The scholarship covered full tuition housing and a modest living allowance for 4 years of undergraduate study, with a renewable graduate component for students who demonstrated exceptional commitment. I named it after my son, because I wanted the name Caleb Sterling to be associated somewhere in the world with the opening of doors rather than the closing of them. I wanted there to be people walking through their lives, becoming engineers, becoming navigators, becoming people of substance and contribution, who had gotten there partly because of a name that its owner had been in the process of disgracing. In the 10 years since I established the fund, I had personally attended the annual awards ceremony every October without exception. I did not announce my attendance in advance. I arrived, quietly sat in the back row, and watched the recipients receive their awards. And afterward, I spent time with each of them individually, asking about their studies, their families, their plans. I brought nothing with me but my attention and my time, which are the two things I have always believed matter more than money, even when the money is substantial. There was a young man named Marcus Webb, not the attorney, a different Marcus entirely, who received the scholarship 8 years ago, the son of a welder from Dundalk, who had died of a heart attack when Marcus was 14. He had come to the ceremony in a suit that was slightly too large for him and shaken my hand with both of his and said with a directness that reminded me painfully of the son I was in the process of losing, "Mr. Sterling, I am going to make sure this means something. I promise you that." I had believed him. And I had been right to believe him, because Marcus Webb was now a marine engineer at a firm in Annapolis, the first person in his family to hold a professional degree. With a daughter of his own named Catherine, a coincidence that had made me catch my breath when he told me at the most recent ceremony, with his hand resting on his little girl's shoulder and his eyes bright with a pride that was entirely his own. He had sent me a letter the previous Christmas. It was 3 pages long, handwritten on plain white paper, and it described in careful, honest detail what the scholarship had meant to his life and to his family's life, and to the life of his daughter, who was 4 years old, and had recently announced her intention to become a ship captain. He signed it with gratitude from a boy who had nothing but was given a name to live up to. I had read that letter 4 times. It was in the top drawer of my desk, where I had put it on the day it arrived, and where it had remained. Harrison called at 9 the following morning after the bail hearing with Caleb's response to the founding charter. "Torres says he read it 3 times, Harrison said. He kept looking at the date. She said he asked her twice to confirm it was correct. What did he say? I asked. Harrison paused in the particular way he pauses when he is about to tell me something that he knows will matter to me in ways that are difficult to measure. He said, and I am quoting directly from Torres's notes, he was building something good with my name while I was destroying everything else. How does a person live with that? The words hit me somewhere deep in the chest, in the place where the grief of the past several days had been accumulating like water behind a dam. My eyes burned suddenly and sharply the way they do when you have been holding something in for long enough that your body decides to override your intentions. I pressed my fingers against the bridge of my nose and breathed through it, and did not cry because I had not cried since Catherine's funeral, and I did not intend to start now. But it was closer than it had been in a very long time. Torres also said, Harrison continued carefully, that after he said that he sat quietly for several minutes, and then he asked her one question. He asked whether the boy in the photograph, Aiden, knew anything about him. What did she tell him? I asked. She told him the truth, that to her knowledge the boy did not yet know who his father was, that decision had not yet been made. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window. The rain from the previous afternoon had cleared overnight, and the harbor was sharp and bright under a pale autumn sky, the water moving in long, slow swells that caught the morning light and broke it into pieces. Harrison, I said, when Caleb is released, whenever that is, however long it takes, I want you to give him one more thing from me. Not a document, not a legal filing. What? Harrison asked. An address, I said. Elena's address in Providence, and a note that says she does not owe you anything. Neither does he. But if you become someone worth knowing, the door is not permanently closed. That decision is yours to earn. Harrison wrote it down. I heard his pen moving slow and deliberate the way it moves when he is writing something he understands is important. You are giving him a way back, he said. I am giving him a direction, I said. Whether he walks toward it is entirely up to him. I have spent 10 years doing things that were entirely up to me. This part is his. I turned away from the window and looked at the photograph of Aiden on my desk, the boy in the red sweater face turned toward the water shoulders, set with the unconscious confidence of a child who has been loved well and knows it. And I felt for the first time since the night of the gala, something that was not grief or anger or exhaustion. It was something quieter than all of those. Something that had been waiting underneath them all along, patient and unhurried, the way the harbor is patient and unhurried beneath everything built along its edges. It was, I realized, the first small movement of hope. The drive to Providence always took me 2 hours and 14 minutes. I knew that because I had made the trip 11 times in the past 3 years, always alone, always in the early morning before the Baltimore traffic thickened into something unbearable. I would leave my house on Chesapeake Lane at 5:45, stop once at a gas station near the Delaware border for black coffee and a granola bar I never fully ate, and arrive at Elena Reeves's front door on Whitfield Street just as the neighborhood was waking up. This morning was different. This was the first time I was arriving not as a quiet guardian slipping in and out before the rest of the world noticed, but as a grandfather who had just watched his son be arrested on the 11 o'clock news. Harrison had offered to drive me. I told him no. Arthur, he had said over the phone, his voice carrying that particular weight he reserved for moments when he believed I was making an emotional decision disguised as a practical one. You haven't slept. You have a bruised shoulder and a split lip that probably needs stitches. Let me send a car. I need the drive, I told him. I need to think. 2 hours is a long time to think about something that's already done. That's exactly why I need it, I said, and hung up before he could argue further. Elena answered the door before I knocked. She must have heard the car pull up, or perhaps she had been watching from the window, I never asked which. She stood in the doorway in a gray cardigan and dark jeans, her dark hair pulled back loosely, her expression carrying something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. "I saw the news," she said. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes were red at the edges, the kind of red that comes from crying quietly, so that a 5-year-old sleeping down the hall cannot hear. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry you had to see it that way." She stepped aside to let me in without another word, which was one of the things I had always respected most about Elena Reeves. She did not perform her emotions. She felt them fully and privately, and then she moved forward. The house smelled like coffee and crayon wax, and something faintly sweet, a candle perhaps, or the remnants of the blueberry muffins she sometimes baked on Sunday mornings. I had learned the rhythms of this house slowly, visit by visit, the way you learn the tides of an unfamiliar harbor. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking, and set it on the kitchen table, then sat across from me with her own. "How bad is it?" she asked. "For Caleb." I wrapped both hands around the mug. "Bad enough that it will take years to untangle. The civil suit alone could take 18 months. The criminal charge—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "The DA is moving forward. The video is everywhere." Elena closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were steady. "And Aiden. That's why I'm here." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a sealed envelope. It was thick, 31 pages, though it did not look it from the outside. Elena took it from me, slowly turned it over, read her name printed on the front in Harrison's careful handwriting. "What is this?" she asked. "The trust documents," I said. "The original filing, the beneficiary designation, the terms of administration, and the amendment I signed at 3:45 this morning." I watched her face carefully. "Aiden is the primary beneficiary of the Sterling Legacy Trust. Harrison Pike is the named administrator until Aiden turns 25, at which point full control transfers to him." Elena set the envelope down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. "Arthur." Her voice cracked on the second syllable of my name. "I want you to read every page," I said. "I want you to have your own attorney review it. I want you to understand exactly what it says and ask every question you have. And then I want you to keep it somewhere safe." Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard, fighting it, and then the tears came anyway. Not in sobs, but in a slow, quiet flood, the kind that happens when something you have been bracing against for a long time finally does not arrive the way you feared. "I never asked you for this," she said. "I know. I never wanted Aiden to be a pawn in—" "He isn't," I said firmly. "He never was. That is the entire point." She wiped her face with the back of her hand and let out a long, uneven breath. "You could have done this quietly. A wire transfer. A letter from a lawyer. You didn't have to come." "I wanted to come," I said. "I wanted to look you in the eye and tell you myself that this boy will never want for anything that is within my power to give him." We heard him before we saw him, a small thunder of feet in the hallway, and then Aiden appeared in the kitchen doorway in dinosaur pajamas, his dark hair flattened on one side from sleep, clutching something under his arm. "Grandpa Arthur," he said with the absolute certainty of a child who has never once doubted whether he was loved. He crossed the kitchen at a run and collided with my legs, and I wrapped my arms around him and felt something unknot in my chest that I had not even realized was tied. "Good morning, Captain," I said into the top of his head. He pulled back and held up what he had been carrying. It was a boat, small, roughly shaped, built from popsicle sticks and wood glue, and painted an uneven navy blue with a white stripe along the hull that wandered slightly at the bow. It had a small paper sail taped to a toothpick mast, and on the side in Elena's careful handwriting, because Aiden had not yet mastered letters, was a single word, Sterling. "I made it!" Aiden announced with enormous gravity. "It took 4 days. Mom helped with the glue part because the glue is hot, and I'm not allowed to do the hot part yet." My throat tightened. I took the boat from him with both hands and turned it over slowly, examining every imperfect joint, every lopsided plank, every drop of dried glue that had spilled over the edge of the hull and hardened into something permanent. "It's the finest ship I have ever held," I told him, and I meant it completely. Aiden beamed that particular beam of a child who has worked hard on something and been told by someone whose opinion matters to him that the work was worth it. Then he tugged my sleeve and said, "Are you going to put it in your safe like the other one?" I looked up at Elena. She was watching us from across the table, her coffee forgotten, her eyes still bright. She gave me a small nod she had told him then. "Not everything, but enough." "Yes," I said to Aiden. "Right next to the other one, where it will be safe." He seemed deeply satisfied by this answer, and immediately began explaining to me at considerable length and with great technical detail the engineering decisions he had made in constructing the vessel. I listened to every word. Elena watched us and did not say anything at all. She did not need to. Some things do not require words to be fully understood. I left Providence at noon, the popsicle stick boat, wrapped carefully in the cloth I kept in the glove compartment, an old habit from the dock years when there was always something fragile worth protecting from the weather. The drive back was quiet. The coffee Harrison had warned me I needed was cold in the cup holder. The Delaware border gas station appeared and disappeared in the rearview mirror without my stopping. I thought about a 5-year-old boy in navy pajamas who named his boat Sterling without being asked to. I thought about a woman who cried quietly so her son could not hear, who read 31 pages of legal documents without flinching, who had raised a good child alone and without complaint, in a house that smelled like blueberry muffins and crayon wax. I thought about what Harrison had said to me the night before, just before I signed the trust amendment. "You know you didn't have to put his name on it," he had said, meaning the fund, meaning Caleb. "Yes, I did," I had told him. A man should leave something behind that outlasts his worst moment. I was not sure in that moment whether I was talking about Caleb or about myself. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps that was precisely the point. The 2 boats were still on the desk. When I came back to the study, the red one and the navy one exactly where I had left them. I did not turn the lamp on. I sat down beside them in the dark and let my hand rest near the bow of the red one without touching it. My shoulder ached. My lip was tight where it had crusted over. I had been awake for 36 hours, and I did not feel the least bit like sleeping. I pressed my thumb gently against the curve of Caleb's keel and felt the old grief move through me. Not the sharp, sudden kind that had come when Catherine died, but the long, slow kind that lives in the bones and surfaces only when you are still enough to feel it. The grief of watching a child become someone you no longer recognize. The grief of knowing that somewhere in that transformation, there are choices you made that contributed to the distance, and being unable to go back far enough to change them. I had been a good provider. I had been present at dinner school events, little league games, where Caleb played third base and dove for grounders with a reckless commitment that made me quietly proud. But I had also been, in the years after Catherine died, a man who buried himself in work, because work was the one place where grief could not follow him past the office door. Caleb had grown up beside a man who was excellent at building companies and considerably less practiced at building the kind of stillness a boy sometimes needs from his father. I had known this for a long time. I had not always known what to do with the knowing. My phone buzzed at 8:47 in the evening. Harrison. "Tell me," I said. "Bail hearing is set for Thursday morning." He said, his voice steady and professional. "Judge Randolph Hale, Baltimore City Circuit. The DA is opposing bail. A private defense attorney named Daniel Garrison has entered his appearance for Caleb. Forsyth referred him. Apparently he called in a favor." "Forsyth is competent," I said. "Better than competent. He'll push for personal recognizance." Harrison paused. "Arthur, there's something else." "Go ahead." "Angela Torres delivered the photograph and the charter to Caleb this afternoon. He spent 2 hours with them." A shorter pause. "He asked her to send you something. A letter, handwritten, 3 pages. I straightened in my chair. "Send the original, by courier. I want to read it the way he wrote it." A beat of silence. Then Harrison said quietly, "I think that's right." Harrison. I reached out and placed 2 fingers lightly on the bow of Caleb's red boat. The paint was cool under my fingertips, worn smooth by 30 years of occasional touch. "How many pages did you say?" 3, Harrison said. "But the last page is mostly blank. There are only 3 words on it." My chest tightened. My fingers did not move from the bow of the boat. "I'll be here," I told him. "See, I know," Harrison said. "Good night, Arthur." "Good night." I sat in the study for a long time after that, the lamp throwing its small circle of light across the wood. 2 boats on a desk. 30 years between them. 3 words on the last page of a letter that had not yet arrived. I reached over and turned off the lamp. In the dark, I sat with all of it. The grief and the anger and the stubborn, unreasonable love that had never once asked my permission before arriving, and I waited for morning. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. A young paralegal named James Whitfield delivered it by hand at 9:17 in the morning, holding the envelope with both hands, the way you carry something when you understand without being told that what you are holding matters. "Mr. Sterling," he said simply. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. Caleb's handwriting was on the front, my name, my address in the deliberate cursive he had developed in the 4th grade and never quite abandoned. I had read thousands of documents in my life. I had never once needed to steady myself against a wall before opening one. I went to my study and placed the envelope between the 2 boats on my desk, the red one and the navy one, before I broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on yellow legal paper in blue ink. Dad. "I have started this letter 11 times. I am not going to ask you to drop the charges. I am not going to ask you for anything, because I have spent 3 days reading the charter of a scholarship fund that carries my name and understanding for the first time what it means to ask for nothing in return." I pressed my knuckles hard against my mouth until the tightening in my throat eased enough to continue. The honest answer is that I knew Elena was pregnant. Isabella told me the child wasn't mine. I believed her because I wanted to. I told myself it was a clean break. I told myself Elena would be fine. I was a coward. I want you to know that I know that. The second page was harder. Caleb wrote about the early mornings at the Baltimore Yard, a boy in a hard hat 3 sizes too large sitting on the dock while I walked the ships with the engineers. He wrote that those mornings were the happiest of his childhood. Not the birthdays, not Christmas. The dock mornings, the cold air, the diesel smell, and the feeling of being beside his father while his father was doing something that mattered. I don't know when I stopped wanting to be next to you and started wanting to replace you instead. They were not the same thing. I understand that now. My eyes burned. I let them. The third page had very little on it. One paragraph, then 3 words centered on an otherwise blank page. I am not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned that yet. But I would like to find out if the person I used to be is still recoverable. Whatever you decide, I understand. Caleb, and below that? Alone in the center of the page, I am sorry. I set the letter down between the 2 boats. I looked at the red one and the navy one, each imperfect, each made with the same stubborn, inarticulate love. Then I reached for my phone and called Elena. Because some things cannot be finished alone, and because a 5-year-old boy in Providence was waiting with a caterpillar in a jar and a hand outstretched to show his grandfather the most important thing in the world. The ships were never the point at all. I have told you this family story not because I am proud of every chapter in it, but because the chapters we are most ashamed of are often the ones most worth telling. I am 72 years old. I built a company with my hands and nearly lost my son with the same ones. These grandpa stories are never just about the victories, they are about the long, quiet failures that happen inside a home when a father chooses work over presence one too many times. If this family story has taught me anything, it is that a man can construct an empire and still fail to build the one thing that matters most, a place where the people he loves feel safe enough to stay. Do not be like me. Do not wait until the damage is done before you put down the work and sit with your child. Do not mistake providing for presence. The harbor will always be there. Your children will not always be 7 years old with sawdust on their shoes. I am not a perfect man, but I have learned that God does not promise us easy families. He promises us the strength to keep showing up for them. Some days that promise is the only thing I hold on to. If these grandpa stories moved something in you, if somewhere in this family story you recognized a father, a son, or a version of yourself still worth recovering, leave a comment and tell me. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe love is always worth the long, hard work of rebuilding, subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A gentle note. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and human understanding. If that is not what you are looking for, we understand completely, and we are grateful for every moment you have shared here.